If we look at refugees in particular, how does race play into the refugee crisis that's affecting the world globally right now?
I mean, a big part of it is even how we decide who is a refugee and who isn't, and under what circumstances. In the United States, domestically, we'll use the term refugee for people who we actually want to take care of, as opposed to people we don't. So after Hurricane Katrina, there were people who we called refugees when they were looking for food, and then they were white, and then the black folk we called looters when they were looking for food in the same water. Globally, sometimes the term refugee becomes a way to think about who's vulnerable and who's not, who's worthy of protection and who's not. So if someone is from Russia or 2000s Kosovo, we can say, okay, these people need our help. Then there are ways that darker hued refugees will say, well, do they share our values? Are we safe? Are they a security threat? Even none of the evidence suggests they are. Race often shapes, colors even, how we talk about who they are and what they deserve.
To that effect then, are there deemable good refugees and bad refugees and immigrants? And what do we mean when we use those terms very loosely? The language is so important here.
Absolutely. I mean, in my political imagination, I'd say there's no such thing as a good or a bad refugee. You're just a refugee. And you're a refugee because of a set of processes that are always outside of your sphere of control. To me, the idea of good and bad or acceptable or unacceptable isn't the right framework. Unfortunately, we either use that language explicitly or we smuggle it in through other means when we talk about the process. So for example, we talk about people who will be burdens on our economy. Oh, we can't let them in, they'll be a burden on, we can't let these Mexicans into the United States, they'll be a burden on our economy, they'll steal the jobs. You know, this becomes the language we use to really say they're not the right kind of immigrants. In France, we'll say, well, what do we do with these Algerians? I don't know, will they disrupt our way of life? What does that mean? It means, are they going to change our Eurocentric, white supremacist, Christian-centered norms of how the world should operate?
But to be fair, to push back a little bit on that, if we just let everybody in because they don't like where they live or they think that where they live isn't good enough, then that is an abstract, abject, all and everyone in policy, and that is unsustainable. I don't care if you're Europe or America or the global north. So
Agreed.
The idea of good and bad refugees might be ideologically troubling, but in reality, we need it.
Well, you don't need a distinction between good and bad. You just need sustainable policies. You could make the case that they're all worthy of getting in, but we don't have a sustainable framework for letting every single person in the world through the border. But we can't stop there. And the problem is we often use that as an excuse to do nothing. But what do we do about it? If we say every person from Syria can't come here, right? Which, again, they're not trying to. They go to Lebanon, there are a million places they go other than here. But every Syrian who wants to come here, we can't let in, fine. But what will we do to create some kind of refuge for them somewhere? What can we do to redress the policies of the Assad regime in Syria? And we've had opportunities to. When we've literally, whether it's changing the red line, whether it's giving a hands-off approach, whether it's in other decades actually funding the project, there are things that we've done to create that. So now we have to do work to undo that.
But this idea, I mean, like of collective guilt that Americans should feel for what happened in America during slavery, or what Europeans should feel of what happened in the 20th century with the 2 world wars and xenophobia. We cannot use those excuses to justify an open border policy now. We just can't. That concept itself is inherently wrong, surely.
I agree. That's why I wouldn't make that argument. For me, it's not about guilt. It's about responsibility.
But why are Germans more inherently responsible than, say, the Turks, Turkey or Lebanon or Jordan and places like that?
I think it's an ethical responsibility, not just a historical one. Although I do think they're linked. And one is those who have more should do more because they have more. Do I think that the United States or the UK should play a larger role? Yes. Partly because of the historical record, to be sure, but also because there are more resources, there's more space, and they have a more direct impact on policy.
What is the problem with calling somebody illegal or an alien?
For me, it's there's a philosophical argument. I think the idea of the nation state itself is very problematic, and when we refer to people as legal versus illegal and alien and all these sorts of languages, it reinforces something that I think we should be problematizing, and that is the idea of the nation state itself. The other thing oftentimes is that when it comes to the question of refugees, it's very easy to lose sight of their humanity. It's very easy to lose sight of their identity as people. And when you begin to refer to people as alien, which for people doesn't necessarily speak to the most literal meaning of the term, but rather literally something foreign, something outside of our social universe, our social sphere. When we refer to people as illegals and as opposed to humans, it becomes very easy to deploy policies and actions against them that are unconscionable. It's easy to throw them away. They become nobody.
Now, you talk a lot about nobodies in your work. What is a nobody? Who's a nobody?
I use the word nobody in my work to talk about people who have been rendered marginal or disposable by society. The way they get treated through the criminal justice system, through the way we police, through the educational processes that we undergo, and even through the global refugee crisis. There are certain people whose lives simply aren't assigned the same value as others, and they get rendered as nobody. And in our society, when people are rendered nobody, we don't have to invest in them. We can just throw them away. You know, why give someone drug treatment if we can put them in a prison? Why invest in schools if we can just say we have a dropout problem, and then let them fend for themselves on the street? This way of framing people really speaks to the moment we're in the 21st century. Language is key. Again, the use of particular terms can spotlight someone's humanity, their worthiness, the need to invest in them, or it can make them disposable. And so it's very important for us to use language that is humanizing and that invokes possibility.
Mm-hmm. How important and crucial is the role of the media when it comes to framing incredibly important and seismic debates, like, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement or the refugee crisis?
It tells us what stories matter and what stories don't. Just by what gets covered, we have a sense of whose life is worth covering. And then within the coverage, it helps us understand the terms of debate. We get to decide what's worth fighting for and what's not, what's changeable and what's not. The media framing in many ways limits, it can expand possibilities, but it often limits possibilities for how we can understand something.
The politicization of refugees, like the top lines you read in tabloid newspapers or in social commentaries or on cable news, that politicization of the refugee crisis, it has a lot of effects, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on what that does.
It has a lot of effects because it makes them a political football rather than a site of investment and a site of urgency at the humanitarian level. It becomes a question of, well, Donald Trump's against it, so I have to be for it. And when we frame things in that way, as political issues rather than substantive human issues, I think it gets into a very dangerous territory, because oftentimes the choices we're making about whether or not to embrace a policy or not aren't informed by the economic or social or cultural climate, but by a very particular agenda in a nation state. And that can't be the driving force anymore. One
of the things that I find really interesting in the work that you've done on otherness, that you speak a lot about, is this idea of linking violence, intolerance, otherness to specific groups. And that language seems to be pervasive. So whether we're talking about Nigerian economic migrants coming to Europe, or Syrians, or my home country, Afghanistan, people coming to Western Europe, or Salvadorians, Venezuelans coming into America, they all seem to be intolerant, have a completely different way of life to us, and are violent. And almost the same language is used when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, or Momentum, or progressive groups. Where is this coming from, and how do we battle that?
I think there's two things. I think one, there is a deeply rooted fear of otherness, of Black and brown people in particular. Other kinds of otherness matter too, like Muslimness, even if you're a white Muslim, right? There's still something about that thing.
Right.
But I would argue it's because they're linking you to Black and brown people.
Right.
And I think there's a deep-seated fear of that. And so that fear almost, it makes it impossible to see our humanity. And so whether it's a movement that asserts that Black lives matter, something which should not be really that controversial, Black lives matter, right? Or whether it's a social policy that says we need to provide food to people who are hungry, or shelter to people who are homeless, because we have it, becomes something that people just aren't easy with because they want to know what's next. But I think there's a broader and more overarching problem of white supremacy. And I think people want to hold on to whiteness. There's a wonderful book, classic book, written in 1935 by W.E.B. Du Bois. And he's talking about the Reconstruction period after slavery, and he asked the question, why would a white worker not want to end slavery? If you're a white worker, you should want slavery to end too, because if there's a slave, then clearly you're never going to get the right wage because there's someone who's doing it for nothing. Unfortunately, he said the white worker sides with the planner, the bosses, the managerial class. He said not because it makes economic sense, but because they accumulate what he called the psychic wages of whiteness, almost whiteness as a kind of property. I want to hold on to whiteness and close ranks around that rather than my own economic interests. If you can get people to do that during slavery, if you can get people to do that when they vote Bush or Trump, if you can get people to constantly imagine that their lot it should be cast with their race rather than their actual material realities, you can get people to do anything. And that's where we are right now.